Good evening, everyone. Welcome to a special edition of the Carolinas Weather Group. We are here meeting at 9 o'clock on September 30th. Very important weather situation going on throughout the southeast and especially the Carolinas. We've assembled meteorologists from all over the state of North Carolina to kind of get in tonight, talk a little bit about what we can expect for the next few days here in North Carolina and South Carolina, and kind of give you an idea of what's going to be happening through the weekend. So I know all our TV guys have promos to go shoot and get ready for the news, so we'll kind of keep it short and sweet. Everybody should know each other. After the end of the show, we'll have all our guests promote their social media. That way you can contact them on Twitter or Facebook if you have any specific questions. So with that, I want to toss it over to Ricky Matthews. He's going to be conducting our discussion tonight.
All right. Thank you, Scotty. Yeah, as Scotty mentioned, we're dealing with really two different or maybe even 3 or 4 different, depending on how you.
And we're off to a roaring start.
Okay, so what Ricky was saying was we're talking about the upcoming
that are morphing into.
All right, I'm going to try to take over here. We're talking about a couple of systems moving in, an upper level low, also Hurricane Joaquin that is just off the Atlantic southeast coast in the Atlantic Ocean, and how that's going to affect our weather. Throughout the past couple of days, we've been watching these models come in, and they've been getting higher rainfall amounts, and now the hurricane track is actually tracking more towards the eastern part of North Carolina. So I'm going to start out east with Matt. Let him kind of talk about what they are doing right now in the Greenville area to get ready for this storm system.
Yeah, it's certainly been a process these last couple of days from the initial National Hurricane Center look on it as a tropical depression, staying as a weak tropical depression, maybe a tropical storm. Now we're starting to talk about the possibility of maybe a Category 3 major hurricane off the coast of the East Coast. Specifically, everybody keeps saying the Carolinas, and I keep joking with my meteorology staff, that we're hoping for South Carolina, but it doesn't look like that's going to be the case as we go into the weekend. Looking at possibly a hit from North Carolina northward to Virginia. And the problem right now, what I'm watching is we actually just gained about another 1 to 2 inches of rain through our DMA, which is east of I-95. On top of that, the rain that is coming for Thursday night, the rain that's coming on Friday night, and Saturday morning, get a little bit of a break, and then the potential, whatever Joaquin decides to do, adding to those totals. The big challenge for us here in East North Carolina is trying to separate these two stories. We want to make sure the public knows that there is a threat from Joaquin, but also from this rain event initially between Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Yeah, a little nerve-wracking. It's not exactly the most calm situation around here through WITN, but we're hoping to calm people that are going to be watching later on tonight.
And Matt, I think it's really important that we still point out this time that the track's very uncertain. There's still a lot of uncertainty whether it even goes out to sea potentially, as the European model's been suggesting, or if it curves further north and west, maybe hits towards Wilmington or something like that, or further north. Talking from an impact standpoint, what's going to be the difference between a hit further south and then a hit further north for the eastern portions of North Carolina?
Yeah, it's all about the flooding, but also the storm surge. It's really scary to see those models bring it in almost like a beeline to the west. We got a lot of rivers that are oriented from the west to the east. So whenever you get a system like this that comes in from the east to the west, you're pushing a lot of that water back up. Storm surge through parts of Beaufort County or Washington, Chocowinity, up the Tar River is something that we're really concerned with. A lot of the systems that come through, Irene, for example, came in from the south. But this kind of direction, this goes back to almost kind of like a Dennis-type track. I don't think we're going to see anything like Floyd. Floyd was the result of Dennis. Remember, back in 1999, those two went hand in hand. The kind of track this is taking is something similar to Dennis, which we did have a lot of flooding down towards the mouth of the rivers. And then you fast forward to Floyd, we actually had all the flooding upriver. So that's something that we're going to be tracking very closely, depending on how this comes in when we talk about the storm surge and impacts here in Eastern North Carolina, because it is low-lying areas. You talk about the Outer Banks, well, that's all the way through the Sound as well with this low terrain.
We'll come back and revisit the river flooding in a minute, but I want to jump over to Gary to just talk a little bit about rainfall towards central North Carolina. We'll kind of take this from the east, and then I'll go all the way west, eventually reaching Chris and I in portions of Tennessee. But Gary, for central North Carolina, we've been talking about potential for very heavy rainfall starting the next couple of days, and then kind of looking ahead to the weekend, just watching the hurricane and the impacts that could bring.
Yeah, I mean, we've already gone through several days after a stretch of 10, 12 days where we had absolutely no rain, just beautiful weather. And then we switched over into this pattern where we've seen a decent amount of rain over the last 3 or 4 days. Now, on top of that, we've got actually across parts of eastern North Carolina right now, we've got some heavier thunderstorms that are ongoing, so that's going to add insult to injury. But then if you put that heavier rainfall that's expected to develop mainly tomorrow night, continuing into Friday, early Saturday, that right there is, you know, a possible accumulation of 5 to 10 inches of rainfall on already saturated grounds. It's like Matt said, we're not looking at a flooding situation like we had with Dennis and Floyd, but certainly that is going to cause some serious flooding issues. Then if you add this hurricane coming in, even if it maintains the track that it's on right now, and if it were to just brush the northern Outer Banks, not only would we get a little bit more tropical moisture, which could intensify some areas of flooding, but then you put the wind factor into it. So with saturated grounds, all of a sudden we've got the possibility of flooding. Now we've also got the possibility of trees coming down, numerous trees coming down. And to be honest with you guys, that's what kind of concerns me, is that we've got this westward trend that, you know, personally, I'm hoping the Euro's right, but, you know, there are a lot of the models that are pulling this thing westward, and if we were to have a more westward track where this thing comes up through the coastal plain, possibly into central North Carolina, that just means the wind field's going to be a lot rougher, and that means we're going to have a lot more problems when it comes to wind. So, and I think we're trying to focus on what Matt was saying too, is to let the people know that we're dealing with 2 different situations right now. If Joaquin wasn't even in the equation, we'd be looking at the flooding situation going into the weekend. But now when you throw the hurricane in there, well, just as soon as the rain stops, well, not stops, but kind of tapers off a little bit, all of a sudden we've got a hurricane that we've got to deal with. So I think the public really, really needs to understand that we are dealing with 2 different situations. And to be honest with you, it's a rare situation to have back-to-back systems like that. And I think people really need to understand the danger that we are facing right now on multiple levels, between the possibility of flooding, and then when the hurricane gets here, potentially the possibility of more flooding and again, wind issues.
You made a very good point about the saturated ground. I remember with Hurricane Isabel, that was a big issue. We had a lot of saturated ground before the storm made landfall through the month of September, and then Isabel came along and didn't take much, even with a tropical storm force winds across eastern Virginia, knocked down a ton of trees across the whole state. Grant and Tim, I'll let you 2 jump in here. You're a little bit slightly further west, and I want you to comment first on the last couple of days and just kind of walk us through how wet it's been across some portions of your viewing area, and how that's going to play into potentially flooding in both urban areas and maybe river flooding particularly too.
Well, you know, Tim actually was working over the weekend when we had a lot of that rain. He worked Monday as well, but so I'll kind of let him touch on that first. Tim, want to go ahead and talk about that?
Tim, you're still muted there.
Unmuting now. There we go. Yeah, over the weekend, you know, we started seeing our rain Thursday night. It pretty much just ended yesterday with some mounds of heavy rain. Some of those heavier rain bands that set up over the areas that already saw a bunch of rain finally started to cause big flooding yesterday. Rockingham County, Stokes County, into southern Virginia, the Danville area, and into Patrick County had major flooding yesterday. Happened very quickly. The rivers rose very quickly. They are just now coming below flood stage. Some folks in our viewing area, some of our weather spotters, totaling over 10 inches of rain in about 5 days. This is after seeing hardly any rain the entire month of September. So we've been begging for it, and then we got about 5 to 10 inches, especially north of I-40. South of I-40, not so bad. You know, Montgomery County had hardly anything, maybe over 1 inch to 2 inches, and that's about it. Comparatively, not so bad. But we're in trouble. We've got a lot of water in the ground right now. We can't take much more of it.
Yeah, and that's the concern moving forward. We got just a ton of rain. A lot of those rainfall totals, even for PTI here in Greensboro, was a little more than 5.5 inches of rain. So a lot of rain there. But certainly, going forward, I think we would say if we just got 2 inches of rain, we would have a lot of problems. And I think the hardest thing for me has been trying to say, you know, it's not two separate storms. While it is, it's one big event, and I don't know what would be worse for us, honestly, if the storm came in and we get the impact coming in from North Carolina, or if Joaquin goes out to sea. I feel like in that instance we may get more rainfall as a result of that, in which case you're going to deal with more issues with flooding, as opposed to, I guess, you have the issues with more wind and down trees if the hurricane were to come inland. So a double-edged sword for us. Certainly, we don't need any more rain. It looks like we have a lot of it headed our way.
And let's hit on that real quick, Grant. Let's talk a little bit about the model differences, because the European model is trying to send the hurricane further out to sea, and the GFS model brings it further into the coast. Talking about rainfall totals, we've seen some insane numbers, really. I can't think of another word for them, honestly, except for insane totals across portions of North Carolina. Talk a little bit about the GFS versus the Euro accumulations, and maybe why we should not hedge our bets on the one or the other.
Well, I think, for the GFS and the Euro, yesterday they were just, through the roof. They were saying 12 to 22 inches of rain. It seems since then they've come down. They're kind of settling there in that, 4 to 7, maybe 8-inch range, with a few places seeing a little bit more than that. So, it seems like they're coming into a little more agreement in terms of the rain totals, but to me, it looked like a lot of what they were doing there was just giving us straight on rain accumulation for a long period of time. I think if you get that storm to come inland, which the GFS is more leaning toward, then you're going to get probably a little bit more break in that rain action. Whereas I think if the Euro goes out to sea, or what happens with the Euro if it goes out to sea, I think it will be more of that steady rainfall, which could amount to a little bit more rain for us.
One of the concerns I have is, a lot of the models have been indicating this very narrow band of intense rainfall, kind of pivoting back and forth, depending on where that sets up and how it sets up. Somebody could get jackpot totals that might be 3, 4, 5 inches higher than areas just outside of that band. So each model is trying to do what it wants to with that narrow band of heavy rain. But that's really a big concern. Whoever gets that likely sees, the highest amounts outside of the hurricane.
It's really similar in some ways to when we're forecasting winter type weather, and we're saying that one little area is going to get that deformation band to set up and get, 5, 6, maybe 7 inches more than some other region does, just because of where it sits, and it's still hard to forecast that exact range. But one thing that I think we're going to have to take into account, I'm going to bring Chris Michaels in from WCYB in Bristol, because he's our closest guy to the North Carolina mountains, and Scotty too. But we're going to have to be dealing with upslope a lot across portions of the Appalachians, to where we're going to need a lot of moisture riding up those mountains, and it's going to cause some tremendous rainfall amounts potentially on the eastern side of the mountains.
Yeah, exactly, Ricky. That's one thing that even today we were concerned about, because in Boone and Blowing Rock we had a flash flood warning. Over the past week or so, we've had some places get about 10 inches of rain, Blowing Rock being one of them, I believe. And so, like Grant just said, you put an additional inch or two, you're already talking some major flooding. Now with the QPF coming out to be 4 to 5 inches in the mountains, it's something to worry about as well. The other thing I want to touch on, though, is the western side and how the wind can have something to do with it. If the GFS track verifies, we could be dealing with a high wind event, especially in East Tennessee. There's some places like Camp Creek that you get that downsloping flow and the air just rushes down from the mountains. With a saturated ground, that wind getting enhanced could do exactly what Gary was saying before. And we're talking tree damage, power lines. We got a lot of forestry around here. I know in central North Carolina, one of the big things is housing developments, and a lot of them built on golf courses with these big pine trees. I know my parents, I'm already concerned about them, that they live in Raleigh in a very wooded development. So that's something that we're going to have to worry about from central North Carolina to East Tennessee, especially though with taking the mountains into account in that downsloping. So yeah, the mountains, North Carolina, especially with a flooding issue, and then I'm thinking if the GFS verifies, we're talking a potential high wind event in some places.
Yeah, and that's really critical. That's probably the thing. Microphone muted. There we go. I think that's a really critical thing, Chris, is the wind plus the rain. I don't think people maybe understand as much of how those two coming together could cause a really significant impact of a full event across a large portion of the whole state almost. Matt, I want to bring you back in real quick here because people who live on the coast often think the main impact from hurricanes is that storm surge.
Right.
But talk a little bit about people who don't live right on the coast, maybe aren't in that Category 1 or 2 storm surge zone, but the impacts that a landfalling hurricane on the eastern North Carolina coastline could still have for them.
Yeah, in fact, we saw that, and it's a really good point, with Irene, Hurricane Irene. It wasn't a really strong wind event at the surface, but if you went up just a little bit to treetop height, right up maybe 20 feet or so, the winds are actually higher aloft than what they were at the surface. So we had a lot of problems inland, although Irene skirted right up the Pamlico Sound east of 17. We still had a lot of tree damage, limbs coming down back inland because of how wide of a wind field that was. And again, it wasn't felt at the surface, so a lot of the sensors weren't picking up along these strong wind gusts. But anything that was elevated up above maybe 20, 25 feet, I certainly felt the effects of the wind field, and some of those trees, and a few trees did come down in parts of Greenville, even though it had nothing to do with storm surge or anything like that.
And one thing that I remember from Hurricane Isabel wasn't so much the storm. It was the aftermath of the storm and the week without power. And if you get a situation where a majority of the state has tree damage and power line damage, you're going to be looking at something like that again potentially, to where it takes a long time to restore power.
Yeah, one of the big things that we've been talking about the last probably 4 or 5 years, we found out with Irene, encouraging people to take cell phone chargers in their emergency kit. I know it's been talked about before for a couple of years, but I'm sure going in the next couple of days, that's something we're going to be harping on, is making sure you have some kind of charger in your emergency kit to keep that cell phone going, or even the iPad. A lot of people are streaming now, so if the cell phone towers stay up, they can still get our signal. They can still get some kind of information, both from Facebook, Twitter, Google+, other sources.
And one thing to hit on there, and we're going to bring in someone from emergency management in a second, but texting versus calling is a very thing after hurricanes, because text messages often will get through, but maybe the phone calls won't because of those backlogged cell phone towers or damaged cell phone towers or something along those lines.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
Scotty, you have someone you want to bring in to comment a little bit on the emergency preparedness.
Yeah, I have William Keller here. He's the one of the emergency managers from McDowell County, and William was here during the years of Francis and Ivan. So McDowell County and the foothills of North Carolina very prone to flooding from tropical systems. And William, one of your concerns right now is you guys have already had a lot of rain this past weekend.
Yeah, some of the areas in northwestern McDowell County have already received up to 12 inches of rainfall, and we're getting additional rain as we speak now. So tonight, emergency management coordinated a meeting with local fire department, rescue, and other agencies to where we brought folks in, did a weather briefing, and essentially just walked through some pre-plans for what could potentially happen with the storm here.
And William, as you guys are going out tomorrow in the public, kind of tell our followers tonight what you would suggest for them to have for their emergency kits if the worst case scenario was to happen.
Yeah, so any basic kit you want to be self-sufficient for at least 72 hours, and as some of the other folks have noted on here, make sure you've got those chargers and got spare batteries, flashlights, and a way to keep that cell phone charged. There's a number of type of products that can assist in keeping cell phones charged in the event of a power outage. But one of the major things that we're going to stress in the next 24 hours is simply talking to family members, to friends, and not hitting the panic button. But it's a good time to be aware and follow the weather forecast and listen to the local emergency management officials in your area who will give up-to-date information as we go into the next 24, 48 hours.
Good points. And people who live on the coast, hopefully, already have that plan in place. But for a lot of people, it's the kind of weariness to leave their house. Comment on that for just a moment in terms of how emergency managers kind of play into the decision of when they make evacuation calls and the thought process that goes into that and the impacts that go into that.
Yeah, we rely a lot on historical events and looking at historical data for the local emergency management. I know here in our county we've got a lot of good history on at what stage a river is at, the effects that we see on businesses, property, life threats, so forth. So it's really a localized decision that takes into account a number of factors, working with a number of agencies. But what we see a lot of times, as you said, people don't want to leave their home. They don't want to evacuate for numerous reasons. But there's really no reason not to follow the recommendations of your local officials there if they're doing voluntary evacuations to try to get people out and to higher ground, and whether it's a shelter or a family member's house. There's nothing worth risking your life over in these types of situations.
I've always told people it's a course of least regret. I really like the personal plea that one of the warning coordination meteorologists up in New Jersey put out before Sandy, and was like, if I'm wrong, you can call me and complain as much as you want on Monday, but I'm going to be happy that you're safe and sound. So.
That's exactly right.
Brad Panovich from WCNC, NBC Charlotte in Charlotte, North Carolina. I want to bring you in and talk a little bit about the why of this storm. The current track from the National Hurricane Center has it off the coast of North Carolina and then kind of making landfall right around Kitty Hawk and then up the Chesapeake Bay as a Category 2 hurricane, weakening as it moves up. The latest updates we've seen from Recon say the storm's around a Category 2 status, pressured around 949 millibars in some spots. Talk a little bit about the why of this storm and the two scenarios that we have that could play out.
Well, it's kind of interesting. I always hate comparing other storms to current storms because I think you could confuse the public. But as far as like a unique setup, there are some correlations with Sandy because you had this cold core kind of autumn type system sitting over the East Coast. You had blocking going on in the North Atlantic. And when you get these type of weird patterns like this, you get weird interactions with systems that don't normally exist together, a tropical system and a cold core system, kind of a fall versus summer type setup. And when you have this setup, you get this cutoff low, kind of an upper trough that becomes negatively tilted, which means it leans back to the west instead of leaning forward or being straight up and down. And when you get that kind of orientation, a couple things can happen. That thing could kick Joaquin off the coast, which is what you're seeing from the European model, but it could also grab it and snag it and kind of slingshot it back into the Carolinas and Virginia. And when you see that in some of the model runs, especially like the GFS, you almost see this Fujiwara effect where the two little pieces of energy wrap around and becomes this big upper level monster kind of storm. It's almost kind of a unique looking system that kind of sits over the southeast for a couple of days. So those two scenarios are still, frankly, quite possible. You worry about that kicking out to sea, the European, which I heard Gary mention, which we would hope would happen, but so much guidance is leaning the other way. It's kind of hard to ignore so much guidance and consistent guidance back to the west. I think the whole GFS versus European model battle is going to have another feather in its cap after this event. But I will tell you this: the GFS has come a long way since Sandy, and the European, for whatever reason, at least in my experience this summer, has not done very well here in the southeast. So that makes me a little cautious about the European solution. But as I mentioned, it's still a possibility, so you can't totally discount it.
Let's hit on the kind of critical parts of this. You mentioned the upper level low, either kicking it out to sea or catching it. Isn't timing very critical in whether it gets kicked out to sea or whether it gets caught up in that upper level low?
Yeah, timing and also intensity. I think it's interesting tonight that the intensity is increasing because as the storm gets stronger, and you'll find this with tropical systems, the stronger they are, the harder they are to move and turn sharply. they're like ships. They're hard to move around. Big ships are hard to move around in the flow. Little weak systems, smaller ships, if you will, are much easier to move into the flow. So I think what you worry about is that it becomes harder to make drastic moves. But you've also noticed in the last 24 hours there's been more of a southwesterly drift to the storm, which means it's getting closer to the trough with time, which in my opinion means it's going to have a chance to snag it a little bit more. I think it'll be really interesting with tonight's guidance to see how it handles the upper trough a little bit better, because the Gulfstream aircraft was doing a steering flow reconnaissance mission today, and there was extra soundings launched on the East Coast. So a lot of that data is being ingested into the evening models, and it'll be interesting to see. Obviously, we already have the track guidance, but I'm waiting to see some of the GFS guidance on what the upper level low strength is and what that ridge over the Atlantic is, because I think that's going to be key. The other interesting thing about timing, and I was just having this conversation here at the station, because the storm's going to be moving parallel to the coast, the timing of landfall is it's very tough to forecast, because if it makes landfall up in Delaware or New Jersey, that could be on Monday. But if it comes up the coast and decides to make a left turn, that could happen like on Saturday morning or even midday Saturday, because the coast is right there. If it just decides to take a left hook, boom, it's inland. And plus you have North Carolina sticks out. It gets hit by a lot of storms because it sticks out into the Atlantic, and it could get clipped very easily. So the timing is going to be really, really difficult. And then I think probably the most interesting thing about this is you're seeing this in some of the guidance. Is this thing doing a loop-de-loop over the Carolinas at some point, and maybe being around through Monday, which would be unbelievable if that happened. If it got wrapped into the upper low, that boy, man, you think flooding's bad now? That would be just horrendous.
And let's bring in Jason Boyer real quick to talk a little bit more about flooding impacts and stuff like that. So I want to give each person a moment to hit on their region and talk a little bit about some of the impacts this storm could have on your area. And I think Jason can hear us. Can you hear us, Jason? Jason may not be able to hear us. Or he may be muted. Well, I think you're still muted. At the top, there should be a little.
There we go. Sorry about that. Sorry about that.
All good.
All good. Yes, obviously our eyes are peeled towards the East Coast as well here. Looking at the guidance, like Brad mentioned, there's still that possibility that it comes farther west, and that would just be devastating for us here. We've already had our serious rains the last 6 days. Even today, more heavy rain has fallen, and in the same areas mostly. But we are certainly concerned. Microclimates around here, you think you got them nailed down, you don't do. There's always some surprise. In most recent event here, I had a Coco Ross for folk in, let's see, where is he? He's south of Black Mountain by about 5.5 miles, and he had 23 inches of rain over the 6-day period. And I confirmed that with the Weather Service, too. So he lives on a ridge. He is perfectly situated for an east-southeast flow, and that is why he saw that much rain, and it just rained continuously for 6 days in his location.
That's incredible. I saw the 10-inch report from the Weather Service in Blacksburg up in Blowing Rock, but 23 inches. Wow. And
yeah.
When we talk about the mountainous terrain, especially over towards some of the Asheville regions and up across portions of Boone, we could be dealing with landslides and potentially debris flows in a few spots up into the Virginia mountains as well, if that amount of rainfall took place.
Absolutely. We had a few mudslides most recently with this rain event the past 6 days, just a few of them, nothing major. But that's also a big concern. The eastern, I'd say the eastern continental divide, for the folks here that understand it better, that area is just going to be ground zero if we get really any moisture in the upper level trough, which we'll certainly get. And, obviously if Joaquin goes far west, that would just be, the worst case scenario for us here with a foot of rain or more if it would pan out. And again, like I said, you get these little niches here, these microclimates, and it's impossible to predict how much on these little ridge areas. And if it comes farther west, and that would certainly be a issue for us. It doesn't take very long for that to happen with trees toppling over, and it could be several days as the issues continue. And
We lost it there. There we go. We're good. Yeah, as you mentioned, there's just so much potential for wind damage, I think, throughout all of the state. And I want to bring Matt back in here real quick as our resident hurricane expert on the East Coast. I'll put you on the spot here real quick.
Sure.
Talk a little bit about some of the modeling, because we've seen some of the models, specifically maybe the more detailed hurricane models, the HWRF, the GFDL, and a few of those some people may have seen floating around social media, really having incredible and intense outputs to where they're saying Category 3, Category 4, or even stronger on their model runs. Talk a little bit about the track record for some of those models and some of the different things they kind of factor in that maybe would make them more or less appealing when it comes to taking in their guidance.
Yeah, I mean, intensity forecasting with the models has always been the real crutch, both with the models and then, of course, the National Hurricane Center as well. It's really hard to figure out not only the structure, but the little pieces of information that you miss when it comes to a system like this, that when it does come ashore, how strong it really is. I think you can categorize it. I've heard the argument before that we portray here in East North Carolina. The category isn't really that big of a deal. Obviously, the winds are going to be winds. It's the way the direction the wind flow, the wind pattern is coming into our area that creates the biggest problems. With this particular event, ratcheting it up to maybe a Category 2 or Category 3 is certainly going to add a little bit more stress to the next couple of days, forecasting-wise. But I still think that the flooding potential and then the storm surge potential as that category goes up, I mean, you're talking about a lot of water. When you get to a Category 3 or Category 4 that is going to be inundating the area. So when you talk about models in general, I always like to look at the pattern. Obviously, the pattern is a big thing and where these models tend to go. But there's also arguments that say that something, the system can weaken significantly before it makes landfall. It can strengthen significantly right before landfall. So what we do here in East North Carolina is obviously prepare for the worst and make sure people know storm surge possibilities, worst case scenario situation along the rivers, and of course those people living along the Outer Banks and the Sound as well.
One of the other things that plays into it a lot is the forward speed of the storm.
Right.
Let's talk a little bit about that and kind of how the storm's going to be kind of sitting where it is now for a day or two, and then it seems like it really starts to accelerate northward on a lot of the guidance and just the forecasts that we've seen.
Yeah, which is fine. I have no problem. If it wants to speed up to 45, 50 miles per hour and take off to the north, no problem there. Yeah, here in East North Carolina, the way Brad was talking about it, the way we stick out like a sore thumb, any change in the direction as it makes landfall has a huge impact on the area. You look at a Category 2 that came through 2 years ago, 4th of July. We had a lot of vacationers down here along the Outer Banks. Really didn't impact us nearly as much because it went along the Outer Banks and out. Much different story when you got something like Irene, or even going back to Dennis or Floyd, that come in from that westerly or easterly direction to the west, which is just the rivers around here really take a beating if you get east to west moving system. So that's what we're trying to avoid if we can.
And Brad, let's bring you back in here for a moment to talk a little bit about the wind field of a storm.
Yeah.
As the storm typically gets stronger, the wind field seems to expand on the system. And with a strengthening system like we've seen tonight, is that something we can expect where it could potentially have a bigger impact?
Well, I think the thing you have to worry about with the larger wind field is its interaction with the non-tropical system, because you see that quite often. You've got an upper low, and then you've got a big ridge to the north, and you're going to create huge pressure gradients up and down the East Coast. That's why even when you look at the European guidance, which has it moving offshore, you still see this really strong onshore flow ahead of the storm as you get the upper low kind of spinning up. So kind of think about it as a massive nor'easter. You would still have a huge wind field well inland and well up the coast. It's almost like a subtropical, I hate the word Frankenstorm, but it's got these elements of different types of storms, and typically when you get these mid-latitude storms like this on the coast, they tend to have huge wind fields. And a couple things that would make me worry about with a system like that is when you spread the wind field out, you obviously increase the amount of surge You saw that with Sandy. I've seen it with large weak tropical systems in the Gulf of Mexico. They sit over the water long enough, they have time to pile up the water. And as the tides go down each day, they don't go down as far. And then the next tide's even higher. And then it goes down a little bit, and then the next tide's even higher. So you build up a lot of surge, and it also brings the winds farther inland. And I think everyone's mentioned this, and it's probably my biggest concern, besides the flooding, which should always be the #1 impact for this event, in my opinion, is the trees coming down with wet soil. And 30, 40 mile an hour wind with wet soil is going to bring a lot of trees down. We're in a drought, as many people know, here in the southeast. A lot of the trees are weakened. They are not in very healthy conditions. So on top of that, I think it would take very little to bring a lot of these trees down. So my biggest fear is that wind field does get large. Even if the storm stays near the coast, we could get 40 mile an hour winds, maybe 50 mile an hour winds inland, and that could bring down a lot of trees, and then that means power lines and all kinds of issues. It's really interesting to try to explain this to the public because of the three, the kind of the trident of parameters we've got going on here that'll make this difficult to forecast, but also means that if you take Joaquin out of the mix, there's still other issues going on, as Gary alluded to at the beginning. I told someone that today. If you take Joaquin out of the mix completely, we still probably have flooding this weekend. It's not like everything just goes away, but because Joaquin moves out, it's just the steroids for this whole system and makes it even worse. I tweeted this out right before we got on, but it's been something like 3,000 some odd days since the last major hurricane on the United States. 3,628 days since the last major hurricane on the U.S. That was Wilma on October 24th in 2005. So I wonder how many people have kind of lost their sense of how to prepare for these type of storms because it's been almost 10 years.
Not to mention, we've heard all the, for lack of a better term, hype about it being an El Nino year and the lack of activity in the Atlantic Ocean and how that's going to play into, quote-unquote, less chance of a hurricane impact along the coastal areas.
Yeah, and it's almost kind of why, yes, this is a significant hurricane by itself, but I almost cringe that we're getting too caught up in the hurricane part of this. There's so many other things going on and so many other impacts. And if we've learned one thing from Sandy, it was not to focus on what we call things, focus on the impacts they bring. When Sandy was approaching and it weakened and it was no longer considered a hurricane, and a lot of people on the Jersey Shore and Long Island, they didn't know how to deal with a hurricane to begin with, and then when it wasn't called a hurricane, they kind of let their guard down. To me, it's like if there's 12 feet of water coming, it doesn't matter what's causing it. That's the impact you need to focus on. And in this case, the wind, the surge, and the freshwater flooding are the impacts. It doesn't really matter what causes those. It just matters that they're coming.
Yep. And if I'm going to take a moment real quick to comment a little bit on Hampton Roads because I'm kind of the person who maybe falls at the closest, and I've sent this link out to a lot of people in Hampton Roads tonight. And so when it comes down to Eastern Virginia impacts, as Matt kind of alluded to, we're still watching the track of the systems and how the impacts will be, because if a system comes a little bit further north or really follows the track the National Hurricane Center has outlined right now, we're going to be dealing with a pretty significant storm surge in addition to the normal hurricane wind and rainfall amounts. Now we're going to have the rainfall before that, which will weaken the trees, and then you get the wind on top of that. It won't be a very good situation. And then as we go, having the storm maybe go a little bit further south, I think we're looking more of like an Isabel kind of comparison to where you get more of that type of level of storm surge. You get the wind and the rain, the tree damage once again, but maybe not higher than Isabel. Now, having said all this, it's a very bad idea to try and compare two storms because no two storms are alike. So always keep in mind that when you're taking into your plans. But as we go through the next couple of days, it'll be wise to keep the track in mind and the impacts that the track could have. Tim, let's bring you back in here for a moment and comment a little bit on basically the gist of everything in your region. I know we've lost Grant here, but I want to try and wrap this up as we're going into 40 minutes here. Kind of give us some of your lasting thoughts on major impacts of the storm. What's the main timeline, what we know and what we don't know?
Right. So for us, the weird thing is we were 80-something today. We're going to be chilly tomorrow, getting cloudy with rain starting to move in. Not big rain Thursday, but I kind of agree with what Brad was saying. You know, we can nitpick the details about the hurricane. We can talk about what kind of a storm it's going to be. Certainly, those impacts are most important to the coast. For us, that might be in the Piedmont of North Carolina or toward the foothills of North Carolina, or just the center part of the state. I think we can slice this a number going to boil down to, no matter what happens, we're getting a lot of flooding. It will either be bad, really bad, or devastating. And then on top of that, you're going to have winds regardless. It's just a question of how bad the winds are going to be. Even if the storm doesn't come in, Joaquin doesn't see wind, 20, 30 miles would be enough in this type of a setup to be a big cause for concern. So to me, no matter what happens, whatever model ends up being right, we're going to have the heavy rain. We're certainly going to have flooding. It's just a question of how bad the flooding is. You know, folks that live near rivers and streams, we had flooding even just the other day that was starting to get up to dangerous levels for them. I think we really could have some very dangerous flooding. It's just a question of how historic will it be with this type of setup. So for us, the flooding is the main point. The wind, that is going to be a big point, and the long-lasting power outages as well. No reason to panic, but certainly big cause for concern if you live in the Piedmont or anywhere in North Carolina with the system.
Good points. Chris, let's bring you in, and I'll let you comment on stuff, even though we both work in the exact same areas. But I'll let you comment on Northeast Tennessee and Southwest Virginia, and why don't we go ahead and throw portions of the North Carolina high country into that too, and the impacts this system may have on us.
Yeah, I think Brad really hit on it, because I actually was talking to my older brother about this, that it doesn't have to have a name on it in order to have a big impact. We are not used to a named storm, but we do put up with flooding because of the terrain. Specifically, the North Carolina high country is what I'm concerned about when it comes to flooding, because we've seen the 10+ inches of rain in blowing rock, like we saw the National Weather Service in Blacksburg report. Saturated ground and winds is another common topic here, but again, that downsloping into parts of East Tennessee, that's something that we see during the winter a lot. We get a lot of these wind advisories and high wind warnings being issued, and if this storm were to make landfall in North Carolina, I would not be shocked to see one of those products being put out, because some of these wind gusts could really get dangerous in parts of East Tennessee with that downsloping. Having said that, a 20 to 30 mile per hour wind gust, like Tim just said, could have a big impact on some of our saturated ground, especially in the North Carolina high country. But first things first, the upper level low could mean some big rains for us. 4 inches of rain, which is being estimated as of the 18th ZGFS, in a span of 2 days, that's still a lot of rain. So that's something that I'm keeping an eye on in East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia, Ricky, as you are as well.
And those impacts coming late Friday into Saturday, and then the track of the hurricane determining what impacts after that, potentially late Saturday into Sunday. Let's jump down to Jason real quick towards the Asheville region and comment on the potential impacts of the storm in his area and kind of the bottom line.
Yeah, well, the bottom line here is really going to be a flooding and wind event concerns. Looking for the flooding to really take shape in many areas farther to the east again. Asheville likely misses out on some of the tremendous rainfall amounts. Some of the latest QPF estimates around 4.5 to 5 inches total. Still a lot, but again, I've been amazed at how well the rivers can push that water downstream, and we just really see very limited flooding, even in large rainfall situations. Now, of course, 2004